Hi, welcome. I'm Charlotte Duran. I'm a producer with KPCC in person. Thank you all for coming out tonight. For those of you who are new to KPCC, we are a multi-platform organization. We're on the air at 89.3. We're online at kpcc.org, and we do lots of in-person events around Southern California, just like the one tonight. So if you want to find out more about us, we're at kpcc.org/in-person. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are live video streaming tonight, so we ask that you not video record this event. And if you are taking photos, please take the flash off your camera. But do connect with us tonight. We'll be on social media. We're at KPCC in person, and we're using the hashtag homelessness. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's host, Libby Dankman.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for spending your Thursday night with us at KPCC. I really appreciate everybody coming out. And we do have, I think you might have heard the RSVPs filled up really quickly. So obviously something that a lot of folks are interested in, and I just want to get started. The 2018 point in time homeless count showed a 3% drop in homelessness across LA County. It also revealed that more people than ever are experiencing homelessness for the first time. City officials, advocates, and community members are working to find solutions, but the situation is complex, and for a lot of observers, the path forward is unclear. So we're hoping to shed some light on that tonight. For this event, we asked you, what questions do you have for local leaders about the homelessness crisis? And what discussion do you think we should be having around homelessness? More than 70 people submitted questions, and over twice that voted. The question that received the most votes by a wide margin focused on housing affordability and homelessness, and solutions that Los Angeles is considering. We're going to tackle that issue with our panel tonight, along with a lot more of your questions. And we've broken the night into two parts. We're going to start with accountability, talking about what's being done right now about homelessness in Los Angeles and what impact it's having. Part two is focused on affordability, looking at policy proposals and issues that will be going to voters that could take a bite out of our homelessness crisis. We are on social, I think Charlotte mentioned. Please connect with us tonight at KPCC in person. If you want to reach me, I'm at LIBDENK. We are using the hashtag tonight, homelessness. So I'd like to introduce our panel for part one. Felicia Adams-Kellum is president and CEO of St. Joseph Center, which has homeless services locations in Venice, Santa Monica, the VA in Westwood, and South LA. Hi, Felicia. Thanks for being here.
Hi there.
Elise Buick is president and CEO of the United Way of Greater Los Angeles. Peter Lynn is executive director of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, or LAHSA. And Rudy Salinas is chief program officer for the Center at Blessed Sacrament, located in Hollywood. This first question is going to go to Peter Lynn first, and then we'll bounce it amongst the panel. Over a year ago, voters greenlit nearly $5 billion in city and county spending to tackle homelessness. That's between Measure H and the Proposition Triple H from the city. Measure H is at the county level. So, Peter, just kind of give us a broad picture right now. We're trying to understand at this point, after H and Triple H have been authorized by voters, where are we with that money? How is it being spent so far, and what kind of impact is it having?
Well, so the two measures address different things. So Prop Triple H is a bond measure, and it's releasing money out for the construction of affordable and permanent supportive housing and some facilities, but it's for the the building of stuff, and that's a 10-year project, and the intent was to build 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing as well as other facilities. Measure H is a durable source of revenue for a variety of services, and I think that the results from the first year were very promising. There were 7,500 people housed just using Measure H monies alone. There were 13,000 people placed into crisis housing or shelter. There were large numbers of people who were assessed. There were a large number of people who were contacted through outreach. So there's an enormous amount of work going on to stand up new programs across the board. They're in programs that address people out in the street, coordinating outreach. They're dealing with short-term rental assistance and rapid rehousing kinds of programs. They're doing long-term rental assistance and deep supportive services under permanent supportive housing programs. Backbone infrastructure to make sure that we have coordination to align all the programming that we have. There's an enormous amount of hiring going on, enormous amounts of training going on. There's a lot of technical assistance for provider organizations to get the capacity they need and scale up to take on these resources over the next 10 years. So huge bodies of work are going forward. And at the same time, we have continued to advance the other programs that we had and make sure that they're all in close alignment. So we were able to place probably more than 18,000 people into housing out of homelessness in 2017, which is an enormous increase over what we had before. So huge amounts of work are going forward, and we're just in the initial stages of rolling that money out.
And you mentioned that 10,000 number. That's something that during the campaign was talked about a lot for Triple H, but the city has kind of dampened expectations recently that maybe we won't hit that 10,000 unit number. It could be as few as 6,000 is the number that I see floated. Can you talk about what goes into that shortfall, that expectation of 10,000 versus 6,000, and what can be done to lift it back up to what voters were hoping for?
So I will offer the caveat that that's not our zone. So we don't, the funding through Triple H is actually developed and it's put out on the street through the city of Los Angeles, the Housing and Community Investment Department, and then facilities are run through the Chief Administrative Officer. But generally speaking, the basic problem is that there were additional monies that were, anticipated through the state No Place Like Home revenues that were anticipated to align with the funding that was, put forward with Triple H. And, it costs a certain amount of money to develop a unit. You're expecting other revenues to sort of buttress the amount we have through Triple H. And if those monies don't come through, you have to put more Triple H in. That makes, just doesn't go as far. So if we can get the No Place Like Home money in, we can get other sources of revenue, we can get back down to where Triple H can extend farther. But it's, it's basic math. It costs a certain number of dollars to develop units now. Land is expensive, labor is expensive, it's pretty expensive to develop things, and you need to cover all those costs.
Elise Buick, I'd love if you wanted to jump in and talk about kind of what especially Measure H money is doing so far in Los Angeles, and what kind of progress has been made, and talk about where we're going from here.
You want to talk about H and Triple H, or just H?
Both would be great.
Okay,
I know
all right,
that
great.
H is a huge. This wraparound services money is a huge deal that United Way has been working with.
Absolutely. Well, hello everyone. I wish I could see you. These are bright lights. So a couple of things I just want to say is, one, thank you to the voters of Los Angeles County for approving not one but two measures. This has been an issue that we have underinvested in for decades, and so I think we're seeing a lot of the results of that, and so we are very grateful that the voters have supported this. I think we're in a catch-up phase and a ramp-up phase, and I think that sometimes it's hard for neighborhoods to understand, and so we're really trying to work with neighborhoods for them to understand what does it take to bring these types of units online. But I think what's great about the H dollars is, as Peter talked about, we now have money for a variety of strategies, and I think the two I'd really like to highlight are prevention. So, our county systems, our government dollars are usually to catch people after they've fallen into a safety net. So for the first time, we now have money to work on prevention, and we should all feel great about that. And I really want to highlight what Peter said about outreach. there's a lot of myths out there about people that are experiencing homelessness. My team doesn't like me to talk about them because they say they reinforce them. But
we might get to those later.
Okay, so but I will just say that outreach is a key component. You have people living on the streets who are traumatized, often have been through violence, often are coping with drugs or alcohol. I don't know if any of you have had mental illness or alcoholism in your family. I have. It is not a linear process. And so you can imagine for folks that are coping and on the streets, they don't trust people. They've had bad experiences. And so they do want to come in off the streets. That is one myth I want to bust. When we ask people, do you want to have a home with a key that is your own, they all say yes. So we have waiting lists of thousands of people who want to come in off the streets, but the trust of our outreach workers to bring them in is important, and we haven't had that. And also, I think many of you know, but we have people that are chronically homeless who have those debilitating conditions, and then we have people who are struggling because of an economic reason. And so those are different solutions for different folks. So I will tout it quite a bit tonight, but we do have an effort called Everyone In. I hope that you will join us in that effort. It's everyoneinla.org. But the reason I want to highlight it tonight is we are tracking the progress through dashboards. We work with Peter and his team on H and Triple H dollars. So
because accountability was a huge question that we got again and again from folks that they said, okay, go ahead, county and city, you're going to take some taxpayer dollars. We want to address this crisis, but we also want to know that there is some accountability behind those dollars. So that's something that you're working to bring to people.
It is. It's online right now, and we will put up more, and we'd love to hear from you. But we have dashboards of H and Triple H. You can drill down by district, by zip code. So all that is on there, and we are trying to kind of be another voice for transparency and accountability. We also are trying to hold our elected officials accountable. So if you don't know, we took that 10,000 goal and we took it to from a 10-year chunk to a 3-year chunk, because let's face it, in 10 years, most of our electeds won't even be there. So they're willing to make a 10-year commitment. So we said, no, how about 3 years? So we took the 10,000 and we got them to commit to 222 units per council member. So we have what we call the 222 tracker. So you can see we have their face, we have their commitment of 222 units, we have how many people have hit that and how many people haven't. There's a few with 0. So I think they could use your support in saying that you want this in their neighborhood. So I think that degree of community support, which I do want to say, I think we have electeds who want to do the right thing, but they need all of you to say yes, that you want it in your neighborhood to help them reach that goal. The last thing I would just say about the cost issue, and I know the next panel, I'm looking at my friend Tony, development in Los Angeles, he can tell you why it's expensive. We're always trying to look at how we bring it down. So the city council has been great at ordinances that will bring those costs down. We can do more. We are also looking at private solutions. So right now, our team is looking at alternatives like prefabricated units and seeing if we can bring some private capital to bear. We take that 10,000 unit goal very seriously. So it will be a public-private partnership, and I think to Peter's point, our plan is very much to get to that goal because we will hope to continue these bonds and measures.
Felicia Adams-Kellum with the St. Joseph Center, can you talk to me about what those Measure H dollars, and if you work with Triple H, but I know Measure H is a big deal for your organization. What are they actually doing on the ground when we're talking about making a difference for homeless people in your service area?
That's a great question. St. Joseph Center has been serving low-income and homeless people for over 40 years. And we were so excited to be a part of the push for Measure H because we had ideas about what would make a difference on the ground. Multidisciplinary teams, street medicine, having people with lived experience on those teams. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a 7-fold increase just because of Measure H in boots on the ground. So I'd say 2 years ago, we had about 500, or I'd say more like, I'll put it in thousands, about 5 1,000 hours of outreach and engagement services going on. This year, we reached 35,000 hours of outreach and engagement. So that's considerable. And we've seen a 12-fold increase in housing assistance. So if we put it in months, it's like a couple years ago, 300 months or so of help for people, low income and homeless, who needed to either stay in their housing or get into housing. And this year we're at 4,100 months of support. So Measure H has made a huge difference. We are the lead service provider for coordinated entry, and coordinated entry really has grown considerably, and we've been able to invest in infrastructure to make a difference, to make sure people don't fall through the cracks, that there's collaboration. And you mentioned accountability. We are tracking our outcomes. We have invested at St. Joseph Center and many of the lead agencies in data systems so that on a daily basis we know where we stand. We're doing huddles in the morning, huddles in the evening to see how we're doing. We're responsive now more than ever. And again, there's more to do. And encampments are a great concern. And so we know that some of the crisis response work that's necessary to make a difference on the sidewalks is necessary and important, but I do believe we're making some real wonderful strides.
And Rudy Salinas, same question to you. Differences on the ground since Measure H dollars have started flowing, and I'd also love to hear about your biggest challenges right now.
Sure. I think if I could just add some perspective before I respond, is to begin that I represent a portion of the city in a service planning area 4 that's made up of Hollywood all the way into Midtown. And I've had the privilege of working in this community for at least the last 10 years. And not to date myself, but when I started, I said this a few times, I was part of a team that would go out with volunteers or really well-intentioned people from their faith community with nothing but peanut butter sandwiches and like maybe a pair of socks to convince someone to come back to a shelter. And to show you how radically we've come and perhaps how much progress we've made in this, through H, we're able to say, and I know it's been said a few times, that there are clinicians on these teams and that there are people who understand addiction and people who they themselves have been homeless as a peer level specialist. So I say this because I think it's important to understand that I've been witness to how advanced these systems have become of approaching and engaging individuals who are on the street. If I could go to the challenges, I think the challenges for us remain in that we perhaps need to improve or enhance the way we win over the hearts and minds of communities that have not faced this before. We're really challenged by the fact that it used to be a time that the only time you saw a person experiencing homelessness was if you drove through Skid Row or if you got on or off any freeway in Los Angeles. But now you can walk 3 or 4 blocks away from your home and see someone. So to this degree, I think part of the understanding here is that when we meet a person in the neighborhood that they're homeless, they're typically not interested in going to a shelter in Skid Row. They're typically not willing to get in the van with me and go somewhere very far away from where I found them. So the challenge for us remains in that when we talk about housing, we're not just talking about the building of permanent supportive housing and the building, like getting scattered site available. We also need to consider what interim housing looks like and that it is prepared to accept a population that is often isolated, often perhaps feels alienated when they walk into these environments. We know from the numbers it's an aging population that has very specific needs that perhaps we've not been prepared for in the past. So I can say that, I mean, there are quite a degree of challenges that we're confident can be solved because when you consider what everyone here has said in the last few minutes, we're very much still at the beginning. I think it's important to understand that this isn't, even though I feel like I've been doing this forever, these changes are very recent. And it's natural to understand that time will be necessary.
And when you say that they don't want to go to a shelter in Skid Row, that's because they're disconnected from their social safety net, or what is the...
It's a combination of factors. There's not one answer. One could argue that it's far from where they have family. It's far from where they went to school. It's far from where they worked. And I often put myself in that situation that if I lost my home tomorrow and I lived in the San Gabriel Valley, why on earth would I go to a foreign part of the city that I'm not familiar with? So I think that comes with an understanding that the populations that we encounter on the streets create a level of community, create a level of support around themselves. That displacement, taking them away from that environment, becomes incredibly challenging, especially when you're considering that at the end, our goal is to put this person in some type of supportive housing so that he or she can thrive.
And is it heartening to you when you hear like the push that Elise Buick was mentioning to build housing in every council district instead of having those clustering around certain service areas?
Right. I can say this, Elise is sitting on the panel with me, but Elise represents a considerable part of the structure through United Way that has given us the ability to have these conversations, that has given the staff that I work with the ability to look at someone in the eye under an overpass of the 101 freeway and tell them that there is an option for them. And having some promise or some ability to say that in every section of the city, we might have some set-aside spaces, even for interim housing, would be huge and just necessary for us. I will say, and I say this just because the teams I represent go into these communities, it is still very challenging to convince a neighborhood that is wealthy and is often not recognized the problem around their area that they need to be part of the solution too.
Yeah. I mean, that the issue of community pushback is something that has been in the news a lot lately, obviously with the bridge shelters proposed in Koreatown and different areas that have had pushback, Venice. Peter, Lynn, do you want to comment on sort of addressing community pushback and the efforts that LASA is making to talk to communities, make them more comfortable with bringing in these shelter and affordable housing solutions?
I appreciate the question. I think there's a lot of fear, and I think that one of the things that we want to do, and the work that's going on that Elise addressed with Everyone In campaign, I think is really important in terms of catalyzing community participation from people who want to be part of the solution. But it's very grassroots work that needs to happen. We need to talk to people. We need to show people facilities. We need to get them to speak to neighborhood councils in the last community that was in opposition but turned around when facilities went in and actually became amenities for communities. And I think that that's the kind of work, but enormous amounts of work is going on from community-based organizations, council district, staff, Elise's organization, the United Way staff and the Everyone In campaign, and lots of grassroots effort. But it really does have to be, I think Everyone In is a great way to organize people and alert people to the opportunities to participate in community planning and citing conversations that are happening in a neighborhood council or in other areas where often there has been just the voices of fear and the voices of opposition. If the folks who would like to be part of the solution, inviting them into the conversation, make sure that. But the people who are expressing fears, the fears are real. They may be unfounded, but they're real fears, and they cut across a lot of different concerns. And I think that speaking to people and understanding what the concerns are and addressing them directly is something that we have to do. And it's a very grassroots and neighborhood by neighborhood effort. But it works if we engage in it. It does work.
And Elise, I mean, if you want to jump in, obviously folks, as Peter said, have real fears about having housing and interim solutions next door. What ways can you communicate with people in those communities to make them feel more comfortable? Because if we have the money, we have the solutions, but neighborhoods do not want to accept them, we're at a standstill.
Well, one thing I do want to, you can tell I'm an optimist, but, we feel like we started a conversation with voters around H and Triple H, and we're continuing that conversation. And we're polling to see where they're at. And so the most heartened I was one of the questions was, would you support housing with services? And we described the services for homeless neighbors in your neighborhood. We couldn't, we didn't try to hide the question. We went very specific. 69% of people said yes. So, and I hope many of them are here tonight. I think that we sometimes think that every neighborhood is all NIMBYs, and so we know that's a vocal force, but I think what we're finding in our work is that people really do want to be part of the solution. We've been doing storytelling events. We did one in Venice. And there's a young man up there who had fallen had been to jail and was in Skid Row and was turning his life around, and he got a job, and he had found housing, and his name was Daniel, and I'm like, I want to hire him, and I want him to be my neighbor. And so I think putting a human face on it, those stories I think are very
First-person
impactful.
narratives, that kinds of thing.
And I also think, when we talk to people, if there's any silver lining on the encampments, although I did have a conversation in Hollywood I have to share with you, so Rudy's not wrong about the high-income neighborhoods, and I'll share that. But when you say the encampments are everywhere now, so I think now we're saying, do you want people in a tent on the sidewalk, or would you rather have them in housing with services, with security, with case managers? They are now realizing that that is a better solution. I do think the pushback, though, is I hear more people saying, well, I want the housing built, but I want it built in those neighborhoods. And so that's what we're going to have to jump the hurdle on, and that's why I think having the 15 all say yes, or having all 88 cities say yes, is such an important part of the solution.
I want to use some visual aid and audio aids for this next question. KPCC reporter Jill Replical recently profiled this couple whose name are Bobby Austin and Bae Shambo. They've been homeless in Orange County for 3 years. Their situation, however, is not just an Orange County situation. It also applies in Los Angeles. And first I want to hear from Bae, and she talked about the stigma that they face as homeless people.
It looks really bad on paper for both of us. We could look like probably monsters out there, but that's not who we are. And when you're trying to climb back up into society, they don't look at who you are. They look at what they can see on paper.
And Bobby also talked about the huge obstacles that they faced finding housing for both of them. Bae was offered a boarding house room through the county contractor, Telecare, but Bobby wouldn't be able to stay with her. And they've been together for 15 years, so that was just a no-go. Here's Bobby.
They want to do reunification with their kids, but it's like, now you're shooting me down and trying to put her in a boarding home and just send me off with a list of numbers and resources and say, good luck. And I'm tired. If I know we have housing, then maybe I'll feel better, but I just don't feel good right now about anything.
Felicia Adams-Kellum, I see you nodding there. That was an obstacle for this couple to get off the streets because they didn't want to separate. Is that something that you see in your work at St. Joseph Center? And why is it tough to find places for couples to stay together?
Well, certainly we see that all the time. And I was reflecting on the challenge of seeing people who are homeless as someone that could be an aunt or an uncle. And when I look up at them, that's not the everyday homeless person that we envision, and yet that's the everyday homeless person. Folks that we pass by and you can just tell they're living in their cars. There's people who I've even found out were working for us and struggling to find a place to live. So yes, the fact that couples want to stay together, people want to stay with their dogs, moms want to stay with their sons who are a little older. And what I'm appreciative of in the post-Measure H time is that we are sensitive to those issues and able to find now innovative ways to keep people together. There was a gentleman who was sleeping outside our access center, and he had a partner. And we connected with him, and we found a place for him to stay. But he declined because he could not leave her outside. So ultimately, we found an interim space before we could get them in to crisis housing. And now he has a job in permanent housing, and he's stable. It turned out that they weren't meant to stay together, but I don't think we would have ever gotten him indoors if we hadn't taken care of her. That was really important to him and part of his healing. So yes, we are seeing problems with affordability and interim housing that is local. So many people are homeless and going to work every day. It's just unbelievable, the number of people that get ready in a car and take showers at the gym. I think that will help us move the dial. Some of us have friends who are struggling to stay indoors, and that makes us a little more sensitive. There's just so much shame, too. So I think as those of us who've come through tough times, or maybe we're struggling, I think we're going to have to be more honest about the struggle so people can see that there are PhDs struggling with homelessness and mental illness.
Peter, could you jump in as well just to comment on what the obstacle is when we're talking about couples being housed together?
So, I think that one of the things that has been a really tremendous paradigm shift within homeless assistance, and it's been a decades-long sort of shift of philosophy, was the appreciation for what we call housing first, which is that it used to be that we'd create programs that had rigid parameters around them, and if you fit the program and you would mind the program rules, you could participate in the program. But and this was intended to get people ready to be housed, because somehow they're not ready. But there was an enormous investment in research, in programs that said, okay, let's try it the other way around. Let's put people in housing and then get the services to them that actually address whatever their concerns are and their issues. And it turns out that that's far more effective in housing people and keeping people housed. So barriers, programmatic barriers like that are real inhibitions to people actually getting housed, and they consistently are ranked high in reasons why people won't participate in interim programs. I won't leave my dog. Okay, well, we'll figure out a way to get your dog in. I won't leave my partner. There are challenges. Sometimes people have really active or fulminant substance use disorders that are hard to bring indoors, and those can be pretty challenging. But the barriers that involve things that we can control and accept. If you have opposite sex partners and they want to share living space in a crisis housing, we got to make room for that. If people have belongings that they want to bring with, we got to make room for that. We got to make room for animals. We got to make, nobody's going to leave their dog. People don't leave their dogs. People will leave anything. They're not going to leave their dog. Partners, all these things, got to make space for that. So we've been working to ensure that we're funding the conversion of space in our crisis system to allow for kennels and space for pets and things like that. But basically, it's shifting the thinking of the program design features. And I will say that we had rapid rehousing, which is sort of short-term rental assistance and case management to get people rehoused and on their way for families for a long time before we had it for single adults. And just to be clear, a couple with no minor is not a family from the perspective of the resources that we have. It's basically two single adults. We didn't have a resource for that for that couple. Measure H now we do. So we can house folks that we just didn't have the financial tools for. But it's really about shifting this sort of concept of what it means to help people and meeting people where they're at.
I'd like to introduce our new housing reporter at KPCC. Matt Tinoco is here in the audience, and he's going to have a question coming up next that I want Rudy to field first, if possible. And this has to do with law enforcement and bridge housing that the mayor has introduced this year.
Hi everybody. My name is Matt Tinoco. I'm KPCC's new housing reporter. And in a second, you should see some pictures up on the screen from a new bridge shelter, which is actually very close to here. So I'm going to be focusing generally on sort of the vast cascade of housing insecurity and homelessness in its many forms, which this is one of the sort of interim solutions that we're looking at in the city of LA. It's a bridge shelter. That's the sort of words, the phrasing for it, which is effectively a bridge between the sort of violent street life and the sort of trauma of living outside, and then getting somebody to a point where you can actually sign a lease. It's not so much as you need to have income, you need to be able to sign a lease. There's a tangible process that goes to that. But basically, more of these will be popping up around the city over the next year and a half or so. But to the point of my question is that earlier this year, Mayor Garcetti signaled that in the vicinity of where these shelters would be, or the facilities would be going, there would be stepped-up law enforcement and sort of sanitation sweeps in the areas, and that made a lot of people worry. I'm kind of curious, why did that make people worry? And then sort of how does the sort of police citation cycle, as well as the sort of sanitation sweeps, how does that affect homeless people and the effect to get them housed?
Sure. So I could start by just using a very personal example from the neighborhood where I work. I work in a council district where the council person has selected a site that appears could ultimately get approval for it to house about 70 people. It happens to be in a very heavy foot traffic area of a tourist portion of the city, and it is surrounded by 3 elementary schools right around it. The concern immediately has to do with the idea or the notion that the safety of the neighborhood would be thrown away if we consider that we're going to attract or draw an element of people experiencing mental health issues or people struggling with drug addiction into that neighborhood. One of the benefits of being in Hollywood is that for 10 years now, we've formed a coalition that has been communicating with each other. And if you compare it to other parts of the city, we're in a services-rich area that has established a level of dialogue with our friends, neighbors, business owners, and everyone to understand that we're helping. We're part of the system that's supporting it. We receive the support of Peter's organization as well as Lisa's to do what we do. The idea of the shelter would be that in a 6 or 8 square block area around the building, there would be enforcement of a city code called 5611, I believe, which is the idea that if you stop or if you occupy any public space on the sidewalk, you could be subject to arrest. To do that, Los Angeles police would have to obviously set aside a portion of its staff in order to have enough coverage to do all this. The interesting part about our neighborhood is that within Hollywood Division LAPD, we have found parts of the department that have actually acted as outreach, connecting us to a number of individuals we've been able to house in the last 3 years. And I know that sounds radical, because if I say LAPD right away, obviously the majority of the population would cringe and think, that's the enemy of the people that we're serving. But to actually find elements within the department that have proven themselves very, very empathetic and very willing to help means that we cling on to these folks as much as possible, because we know that at the end of the day, they are often the ones that get called to these calls ahead of everyone. I mean, there are efforts through the homeless outreach portal, LA Hop, to change some of this now, but the fact is that to some degree, law enforcement, emergency, and fire have always been the first ones that get called whenever there's an issue around homelessness. I will see the good part of the issue has to do with the idea that our relationship with LAPD locally is one that our outreach teams would be able to get in right away and start engaging individuals. We're going to shift our hours to overnight and weekends so that we're not just working in a 9-to-5 setting Monday through Friday. I'm going to share the challenge. The challenge is that the neighborhood that's going to be enforced by this is filled with providers that rely on a population that come through their doors every day. That we have 80 people who sleep the night before on the streets come into our building to participate in wellness classes. So how do we protect the integrity of not just the populations that are still homeless and rely on the LGBT center or our building or Housing Works to do what we do, but how do we protect that population when it's moving through this area? I think the streets are for everyone. It's important to understand that, but we have a responsibility now to accompany, to act as stewards, to be sure that it's understood by law enforcement that we are working with a number of folks who are at the edge of housing, and we run a big risk of losing them if these folks are subjected to arrest.
Rudy, if I could just quickly jump in and ask about the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling this week. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it.
I haven't.
And if any of our panelists have gotten a chance to look at it, that ruled that basically cities can't criminalize the homeless if there are not enough beds available for people to not be sleeping on the street. Peter, have you gotten a chance to kind of look at that ruling, and do you have any concept yet on whether that
it makes perfect sense? I mean, it's intuitively obvious that not allowing people to sleep on the sidewalk, if there is no place for them to sleep, how could you rationally prohibit that? The ruling makes sense. I think the city the city articulated its stance in conjunction with that, and I think it was very clear. And I think that, in the case of Los Angeles, which has the largest unsheltered population in the states, we have an enormous challenge ahead of us as we house people. There are going to be people on the streets for quite some time until we, get them housed and we get this done. So, finding ways to make sure that we have the ability to sort of coexist and bring basic services to people on the sidewalk is the challenge ahead of us. But that really made perfect sense.
I want to just chime in for a minute, though, because I want to just say that from the perspective of the outreach worker, and I know this sounds odd, but there's an army of incredibly motivated, intelligent people who will wake up before dawn tomorrow to walk the streets to engage folks who would typically not walk into a place, say, I need help. The challenge with law enforcement and the challenge with enforcing this is, to a certain degree, that these specialized E6 teams that are now out there coming up with a strategy to house someone run the risk of losing this person if this person feels threatened or feels that he or she needs to move away from the neighborhood because law enforcement is giving them tickets or threatening to take them to jail. This is why I want to add the irony or the strangeness in this, in that more often than not, unless we establish a level of communication with local law enforcement to understand that we have specialized, brilliant teams that have a housing strategy for many of the folks that you're seeing outside, it'll be basically us just chasing ghosts around the city.
Our panel, we're just running a little tight on time right now, so I wanted to open it up to audience questions. If we have any questions in the audience, just go ahead. You can, raise your hand. One of our in-person team is going to come around with a microphone, and just try to keep your questions as succinct as possible because we want to get to as many of you as possible. And our panel is also going to stick around here until the end of the event, so we'll have an option for more questions later as well.
Good evening. Thank you for bringing this panel together. 2 questions. One is in terms of shelters. There's lack of shelters for families and sick beds. When someone is sick, they're asked to leave at 6 in the morning and leave. So how can we bring dignity for those who have been sick, and they can allow a place for them to rest, so instead of them being kicked out? And then thank you for bringing up the question about the Ninth Circuit. But we have, at the end of today's panel, we have to make it clear that criminalization has to end. That this communication, we can communicate with the cops as much as we want, but as long as we come to an agreement that criminalization has to end, we can move forward. We cannot criminalize ourselves out of homelessness. We can only house ourselves out of homelessness. And that is a quote by General Dogan from LA Kent. Thank you.
Thank you. Elise Buick, do you have any comment on the issue of sick beds, or anybody who wants to hop in about the specific issues that, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but our audience member brought up? Yeah, Felicia
I was just
Adams
going to
Kellum.
say, it's absolutely the case we don't have enough respite beds, but the Department of Health Services has been setting aside beds for people who are ill. Absolutely. And we need more, but we certainly are including nurses on our outreach teams to ensure that people are assessed and we're getting them the resources that they need. So it's a very good point there. You mentioned family shelters.
On the family shelter side, we use motels as buffer and overflow for families in crisis. So it's not ideal, but that's part of the way that we handle the overflow and the lack of crisis units. So we're working to build out more space for families in crisis, but in the interim, until we have enough units for families, we definitely use motel vouchers for that.
The goal is to not leave families on the streets. So when they come in, we get them housed that evening.
Going over here.
Hi, my name is Wendy Casing. I live in Venice, California, and been there 6 years, right on the boardwalk, watching homeless every day pack up their stuff, move it from one side to the other, between the buildings to the boardwalk or the grassy knolls. It's a mess. It's gotten so much worse. What we're concerned about, I'm part of Save Venice and Respect Venice. We're 100% opposed to the shelter that's being planned for the MTA lot. But one of the reasons, we've got 25, but one of them is the cost and the cost effectiveness. It's going to help 45 people every 6 months, if that. out of 1,000, over 1,000 homeless, most of whom are not from Venice, some not from LA. We don't think that that's the effective use of our taxpayers' money. And so I wonder how you would address that. It's not even a dent. They're still going to be there. And they're going to be moving back and forth between the shelter and the beach.
And Wendy, your question is, how would you address the concerns of the Venice community?
Yeah, how do you answer that it is not cost-effective use of taxpayers' money? We need permanent homes. We don't need another shelter. Shelters are not the answer. They're obsolete. Most people don't like them. They haven't worked for years, or we wouldn't have 75% more homeless.
And I just want to give our panel a chance to jump in. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you so much for your question. And Valisha, you want to handle this one as well?
Others may want to talk about the cost side, but I want to just say that the bridge model that's being proposed doesn't force people out every day in the morning and then they have to line back up. This is bridge housing, so they don't have to leave, and that they can come and go. However, the idea is that they spend the day working on a housing plan, receiving mental health services, whatever it will take to get them stably housed. So the model is somewhat different than the historical old age shelter model. I just wanted to point that out, because you make a good point. It's hard for them to have to leave every day, move their stuff, come back in. That's a challenge.
Did you want to say something?
I wanted to add a piece from my perspective as far as from the outreach on the streets, in that there are a number of people that I'm going to be able to house from their tent. There are a number of people who will refuse to go to a shelter, but will allow me to do everything I need to do to talk to a landlord and convince someone to let them live in an apartment. But since the last 2 or 3 years, and I say this from being on the streets a lot, I'm seeing an aging population that's very significant. I'm seeing a population that's well above the age of 65 and 75 years old that is really, really struggling. And the idea that I can house these folks from encampments is very, very difficult for me, because I desperately need a space to put them in where they can at least find some health, get connected to medication, so that by the time I'm able to place them in an apartment, they are in a condition where they might be able to sustain themselves. I'm not disagreeing with what you're seeing in your neighborhood at all. I'm just giving you the perspective that for me, the use of a shelter for someone who's 89 years old and who just became homeless for the first time in their life because the rent increased $20 in their neighborhood, living on a fixed income, I desperately need that space so that they can be at least ready for me by the time I place them in an apartment.
And we only have time for one more question. And we're going to bring the panel back at the end for more. Thanks, everybody. And if you want to keep your question in mind, we'll have more time at the end.
Hi, my name is Matthew. This will be a very interesting perspective of something about Peter brought up. I lived in a building as an artist, a mixed building with people that were, taken right off the street and given apartments, like you said, not indoctrinated into it, just here you go, here's an apartment. And I lived there, and it turned into a nightmare. It was there was no wraparound services for these people. There was no security. And, these people were given an open flame, stove, and they were burning things down every night. We had the, fire department. This is what's really happening out there. People are, these buildings are coming up, and they're having a certain amount of apartments, and they're just putting these people in there without any services or any support for them, and so the people that are living in the building are suffering.
And what's your first name, sir? Sorry.
Matthew.
Matthew, thank you, Matthew. Peter, do you want to tackle
so
that?
Obviously, it's not simply handing somebody keys. So that is not the model of supportive housing. And I would be interested in talking to you afterwards about the specifics of the case that you're talking about. But that's not what we do, and that's not the model that we use. But the idea of supportive housing embedded in a housing first philosophy is that housing is really the linchpin resource. For people to be able to get off the street and close their own door enables you to rest, set your burdens down, set down some of your trauma, and function as a human being in a way that you can address the other issues that you have. And the wraparound services have to be there. There's no question that it's sort of one or the other, or sometime later, or maybe, or something. It has to be there. But it's not a programmatic demand. It's about we're meeting people where they're at, what can we get them to, can we keep them engaged, and how do we keep them moving on progress toward the objectives that they have for themselves? Obviously, people need to respect the tenancy obligations that everybody has, and if you're burning things down, that person's not going to be a viable tenant. But the wraparound services are intended to ensure that that's not happening and that people have clear understanding of what their tenancy obligations are. It doesn't throw tenancy obligations out the window. It provides people with the supports that allow them to meet their tenancy obligations.
So like mental health care, things
Right.
like that.
So, like the issues that people have are not their states, it's their behaviors. We had to address behaviors, not sort of states of being. And that's one of the challenges that a lot of old programs had, where they were sobriety-based, for example. If someone became intoxicated, they were removed from the program, they lost their housing. Well, that's a terrible setback for somebody who's trying to get on a path of recovery. And as somebody who's in recovery myself, would not be a very effective way of dealing with somebody to put them back on the street. It's not going to get you sober. That's the kind of challenge that we're trying to overcome with this model, but it's not just handing somebody keys. So the wraparound services have
And we have
be
to
there.
wrap, but Felicia, you have one more thing?
Well, no, it's true, and I'm sorry that happened to you. We have tripled the number of case managers that are out there helping people stay housed, and it's sort of like you said, helping them with cooking, helping make sure they're managing their homes properly, paying rent, and staying with them for as long as they need the support to stay housed, and also working with landlords to make sure that the whole community is not disrupted. So I'm sorry that you had such an unfortunate situation. It doesn't sound like housing first, actually. Yeah.
Just to close, and we've been directly involved in the dialogue at Koreatown. I think what I was struck by is please just get involved and come to the table with a solutions frame and a frame of understanding that these are your neighbors who need your help, and that they deserve dignity. And we found that once we broke down, these are our homeless neighbors, these are where they live, these are the demographics, what % of them are actually from Los Angeles, what are their needs. What started as a very contentious dialogue about one shelter, actually now we're going to have like 4 or 5 sites in Koreatown, and we have permanent and we have transitional, because the community really began to understand what the needs were. And so, be for something. Let's take advantage of these amazing dollars that are at play. But yes, it should be localized to neighborhoods, but get to know your neighbors who are experiencing homelessness and be part of the solution.
And thanks to our Part 1 panel, Elise Buick, you just heard, President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, Peter Lynn, Executive Director of LASA, Rudy Salinas, Chief Program Officer with the Center at Blessed Sacrament, and Valicia Adams-Kellum with St. Joseph Center. They're going to stick around. We're going to have another round of questions at the end here. But I just want to thank everybody for their great questions and start welcoming up Part 2, because affordability was the #1 issue voted on by our audience that you wanted to talk about tonight. So let's get started. Ben Winter is here. He's the Director of Housing and Community Development Policy in the Office of LA Mayor Eric Garcetti. Alan Greenlee is the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. Tony Salazar, President of West Coast Operations for McCormick Barron Salazar, which is a developer that specializes in large-scale urban projects in distressed communities. And Trinidad Ruiz is here, organizer with the Los Angeles Tenants Union. So we've got a serious housing shortage in California. People at the bottom of the income scale are feeling the sharpest pinch. These are the folks, of course, who are most at risk of falling into homelessness. The consulting firm McKinsey estimates at least 30% of households in every part of California can't afford local rents. In some places, it's as high as 60%. Supporters of policy proposals like increasing density and rent control say that these changes are going to make a dent in the homelessness crisis by increasing overall housing stock and adding more affordable housing units. We want to move on to the affordability part of our discussion, and I wanted to start by introducing the gentleman who asked our #1 question of this process. Haik Makmurian is here. and he is a member of the Glendale Tenants Union. And I'm going to have Ben Winter, start off and field this first question. Haik, take it away.
All right. Good evening, folks. Haik Mahmoudan, and I'm with Glendale Tenants Union. I also am an arts advocate and a creative director at Studio 526 in the Skid Row neighborhood of Los Angeles, right down the street. Have been a community organizer for over 10 years, and something that Libby alluded to is, of course, that housing and affordability is the greatest contributing factor to homelessness. There are so many different statistics, but just one very telling one. Incomes have dropped 3% since 2000, and rent costs have gone up 32% since 2000. We talk a lot about math a lot. That's pretty simple math. I want to just hit the importance of policy piece to this is because of the need for meaningful, large-scale, and immediate response to the unaffordability crisis. Part of what I do with Glendale Tenants Union is fight for universal rent control as one particular policy measure. The wider question would be, what policy steps is Los Angeles taking to address housing unaffordability as the biggest contributing factor to homelessness? Thank you.
Ben Winter, you want to start that off?
Great. Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. This is probably one of the biggest challenges in Los Angeles. It's definitely at the top of the mind for voters. Everybody feels the pinch of the housing affordability crisis and the housing shortage. The statistic that I always think of, that I keep in my head, I think of an iceberg, right? The tip of this iceberg is the 32,000 people in LA City that are experiencing homelessness that you see every day on the street. But at the bottom of that iceberg is really this very large amount of housing instability, especially among our lower income Angelinos. Across the county, we have more than 900,000 low-income Angelino families that are in severely unstable housing conditions, right? They pay more than half their income on housing. They're severely overcrowded or insufficient living conditions. So the solutions to that problem, there is no one silver bullet. There's many of them. Mayor Garcetti is really focused on a broad array of programs that really help grow the supply of housing to meet market demand, but to not just build anywhere or build anything, to really do that in a sustainable and equitable way. Sustainable meaning really targeting that growth along our burgeoning transit infrastructure, and equitable, inclusive by really doubling down on how much we're producing on affordable housing that is restricted to lower income and moderate income households, but also really strengthening our rent stabilization policies to help build in stability for the majority of tenants here, or households that are renter families as well. And of course, building out the overall infrastructure, our homeless infrastructure that we talked about now, to really help catch people that fall out of the housing market altogether. Now, there's a lot of different pieces underneath that. When it comes to the equitable piece and the inclusive piece, we're really focused on, for the first few years of our term, is really helping to grow the actual revenue sources to build affordable housing. We've seen revenue be cut from the state and federal government quite a bit over the last decade, but also implement new land use mandates and incentives to really encourage and mandate that the private sector build more equitably and include affordable housing in the developments that they're doing. But we can get into that a little bit later, the details.
Yeah, so carrots and sticks at the city level is what you're talking about. I wanted to get back to the kind of source of the problem. The 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, the state was producing up to 300,000 new housing units a year. However, in the last decade, we've been building closer to 100,000, which is about half of what's needed, according to California's Department of Housing and Community Development. Tony Salazar, I'm curious your take on why building slowed down in California. What's the source of this slowdown, and what's it going to take to change that?
Yeah, let me just talk about the problem as I see it is that we've got in California more people than housing. It's just an imbalance, right? We got too many people here. So either we've got to build more housing or people have to move out. So which one of it? What are you going to do? It's all of our problem. So we're not building fast enough to accommodate the population. And as a result, this demand, and as someone said, incomes are flat, production is flat, and rents just keep on rising. And the people most vulnerable are the working people who just don't earn enough money to pay market rate rents because they just keep going up. So we've got this issue about how do we build more? How can we align ourselves, both the private sector, government, and meet community interest and create more affordable housing? And create it, as Ben was saying, because it isn't just building it, we have to build it in the right locations. Because right now, people, the working people who don't earn enough money to pay market rate rent have to drive until they find affordability. And they're driving long distances, Lancaster and way out past San Bernardino, and they're coming into downtowns. And, but we're building a lot of market rate units. The private sector is what builds and creates housing and creates real estate development. And it has to be, and it only builds affordable housing by merging its strengths with the conventional market, with government, with community interest. And when those three things are aligned, and they're aligned in perfect order, and everyone is rowing in the same direction, do you get housing production done? Secondly, is just this cost. We have an issue with cost here. 5 years ago, my hard construction cost for building something was $150 a square foot. Today, it's $300 a square foot. It has doubled in 5 years. Labor cost has shot up because there's so much development going on in commercial development. All the construction workers are gravitating to that, and they're not wanting to build lower income housing. We've got construction materials that have gone up. We have the price of land because everyone is competing for the limited amount of land that we have. To build homeless housing, they're competing with the market rate developers, the same piece of ground. So there isn't a hierarchy, there isn't a priority about land. Whoever gets it, whoever pays the most money for it, whoever can develop it quickly, that's what's going on. So we have to, again, align ourselves. I tell Ben and Alan all the time, I need three things. I need land, I need financing, and I need political will. Not just political will from politicians, because I've got that from the mayor. It's community groups, it's nonprofit organizations, it's church groups, it's people not suing me because I'm going to build an affordable housing development, using CEQA and taking me to court, which I've been in court with one development trying to build a 60-unit affordable housing development. I've been in court for 4 years with a nonprofit organization, with a community, a neighborhood association. So, and it takes all these things in alignment with all these different groups to make things happen. And when it gets too difficult, my last point, when all these things get too difficult, a developer of housing and real estate is going to take the path of least resistance. It's going to develop the things that are easier to develop and are most profitable. And developing housing for the homeless, developing affordable housing, is not it. You have to have a social mission, and you have to want to work in partnership with others to get it done. I hope that answered your question.
Alan Greenlee, would you be able to hop in as well from the developer side and comment on why the slowdown over the last decade or so and what can be done to fix it?
Well, I think, first of all, try my best never to contradict Tony Salazar, because
that would be a bad call.
Right, it would be a bad call on my part. But we've had our exchanges. I think, the slowdown, and I don't know the answer to the reason why it slowed down. What I can tell you is that we've taken a generation to get to where we are. Taken a generation to get to the place where we've got unprecedented homelessness, where Dr. Dre is mad because he spent $15 million on a house that he bought from Tom Brady and Giselle. I mean, the pain on the cost side of housing is all the way up and down. But the solutions are in place, and they're starting to get traction. So this notion that any one sector of the market needs to be part of the solution is just not true. Everybody needs to be helping. We need to figure out a way to make sure that we're building supportive housing for the homeless, that we create a bridge opportunity for places to sort of settle while they find a place to live permanently. We need to make sure that we're building what is considered traditional affordable housing for people who are not currently homeless and don't have special needs, but who, as a result of the last point in time count, the homeless census, are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population, people who are working for a living and don't necessarily have special needs. And we need to figure out a way to do that both from the traditional subsidized affordable housing perspective, and we need to be able to do that from the traditional market rate perspective. And I'll just mention two things real quickly. One is, on the affordable side, in the last year, we have tripled the number of apartments that we're building compared to the years previously. So the new resources that voters voted on, the programs that they put in place, and the implementation that the city has done has been really terrific, and it's real. The momentum is starting. For the regular guy who drives down the road and sees the tents and doesn't see the apartments, you can wonder about whether it's happening or not. But I can tell you it is absolutely happening. And the other thing that's happening, and I think it's equally important, is that we've created incentive programs for people who build housing to make money, to do it in a way that includes homes for low-income folks too.
I was going to ask about SB 35 at the Sacramento lawmakers passed last year, and it helps streamline at the local level the development of buildings that have at least 10% affordable housing units. Is that something that we're seeing affecting development yet in LA? Ben Winter, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think for us, the mayor supported SB 35, but I think for Los Angeles, the more impactful thing that's happening is actually what voters did back in 2016, in large part with advocates like Alan over here on passing Measure JJJ. In that initiative, it allowed the city to develop what's called a transit-oriented communities program. And that really helps the city streamline the permitting process for more dense multifamily housing and on our commercial boulevards right next to transit in exchange for greater levels of affordability. The new guidelines didn't have to go to council because voters already approved it. So the mayor and the Department of City Planning were able to just implement it. So far, we've had not a lot has been built. Actually, the first development that was permitted was a Triple H project down in 88th and Vermont, which kind of really helped streamline that production. Right now, we've had about 4,000 units of housing apply through that program, more than 20% of which would be affordable to lower income people. And what's really unique to that one is the incentives are so beneficial that we're not only incentivizing more units, we're incentivizing at lower levels of affordability. So 35% of the affordable housing that are applied to the city are going to be affordable at extremely low income levels, which is something that our current incentive programs don't necessarily do. So this is the first one.
I want to welcome in Trinidad Ruiz, who works with tenants and especially what may be the largest tenant strike, renter strike in LA history. You've been helping organize residents of the Burlington Avenue building in Westlake Village. They're in the middle of a strike involving about 180 units. And I understand that you had a legal victory last week from looking at the eviction court situation for your tenants. Do you want to kind of describe where you're at with that and what's going on?
Sure. Just a real quick point of clarification. I'm from the Vibe local of the tenants union. This is a citywide movement, so we're really representing Vibe. And there's like around 8 or 9 locals now around throughout Los Angeles. I have no problem contradicting Tony here. So this idea of that there's not enough housing is just a mirage. There's 200,000 available units in the county of LA, and there's 58,000 people who are homeless. Oh, I think it's 55 now. So this idea of not enough housing is a total fabrication. What's happening is that there's a lack of affordability. So I'll get to this, your question. And I feel like actually the odd man out here, because I don't believe that there's a market solution to this problem. There has to be a public solution to this problem. This is not, the market doesn't care about whether you have a house or not. The market cares about whether they're making money. And for the tenants union, housing represents a future, it represents stability, and it's a fundamental need for a decent life, much like education, much like healthcare, food, and water. This incentivizing of housing, you're incentivizing also displacement. So that leads to my addressing your question here about the Burlington tenants. They live in substandard conditions, and their rents are going up. Why? Because the rents are going up around the area, even though the housing that they live in isn't worth what they're paying now. So again, these are markets. These are market forces driving the cost up of housing. It doesn't make any sense. So it benefits a developer to say, well, you don't have enough housing. Well, let's just create housing. In the city of Los Angeles, there isn't a part of the city that isn't connected in one way or another. If you're displacing tenants, if you're building a project, you're moving out tenants who might live in rent control. They're paying $800, $900 a month in rent for a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom. For families who are on fixed income, especially for retired folks, if they lose that apartment, they're on the street. Now, I know there was talk about adding in affordable housing in these new projects. Well, that's all based on medium income. Medium income in Los Angeles, $69,000 a year. If you're making $54,000, you're considered low income. There's families here that make $24,000. They don't qualify for those affordable units. So it's a huge issue. Now, the case of the Burlington, that isn't rent control, which is why we're pushing for rent control, so vote yes this November, Prop 10, is that they won a recent victory. The landlord was evicting about 85 units, which was about 200 families, and some were doubling up to pay the rent. We had gone through 9 cases in court. 6 of them we won, 3 of them we lost. And the landlord, Lisa Ehrlich, who also serves as the attorney for the buildings, decided to drop all the cases. And I don't think it was out of the goodness of her heart.
She dropped the eviction court
cases. She dropped all of them. I mean, this is a case, these cases would have dragged out for about 3 or 4 years. And so, it was cost effective for her to drop these cases. And now we're just waiting for her to, she's also actually started to do some maintenance. The tenants have been complaining about rats, roaches, awful sewage leaks in the underground parking. What else? Bed bugs, pigeon infestation. You mix water and pigeon feces, it's not good for you. Some children have perpetual colds throughout the entire year. Families have rashes. So, and to add on top of that, here's a rent increase. When you don't have rent control and you incentivize and you rely on these market forces to drive up rents, you have this situation. Now, because there are no protections for tenants who don't live in rent control, and rent control is considered, applies to buildings built on or before 1978, then there is no protection for them. There's no place they can go. They've actually looked throughout all of that area. There's an elementary school right across the street that the children go to. I'll wrap up real quick. And they can't afford Los Angeles. So just to quote a colleague of mine, Tracy, she says, well, you're evicted in Los Angeles. You're evicted from Los Angeles. You're looking at places like, Menifee, Riverside, places that are far from their jobs, from their schools, from the doctors that they go to take their children, from your support network, your grandparents that take care of the kids while you're working 2 jobs to pay the rent. So this is a systemic issue, and I think you got to take that sort of we need rent control, number one, to begin to stabilize this situation, and that's why the tenants union is advocating for Prop 10 this November.
Now that, excuse me, you just made that transition for me, I do want to bring up a question that Gabriela Gomez sent us. She writes that a $15 an hour full-time job just isn't enough to afford the cheapest rent, much less the median in Los Angeles. What's being done about rent control? There's an issue before voters this fall that Trinidad so eloquently was speaking about, Proposition 10 on the California ballot. Ben Winter, just to kind of give us a little clarity on what occurs if Proposition 10 does pass at the statewide level to repeal Costa-Hawkins. Does that mean that rent control happens in Los Angeles after that vote? What exactly occurs if Proposition 10 were to pass? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean for Los Angeles?
Costa-Hawkins was a state law that was passed in the 90s that really kind of prohibits cities, local jurisdictions, from really kind of expanding the scope of and the volume of local rent control policies, which is kind of like Baskin-Robbins, like 31 flavors. There's many different kinds of rent control policies that cities can implement. In Los Angeles, we don't have rent control. We have rent stabilization, which is really kind of it limits the amount of rent that can go up every year. It also provides certain just cause rental protections for tenants that live in the buildings, but as soon as a person vacates that unit, it can flip to market. So there are other stricter forms of rent control that says as soon as that person vacates the unit, then doesn't matter, the rent still stays at that level. So what happens, the mayor has advocated for the repeal of Costa-Hawkins for a while now, even as the state legislature has been thinking about that. And what that would do with the repeal is it just kind of gives local jurisdictions more flexibility to determine the right kind of policy that works for them. And of course, if something like that were to happen, if a repeal would happen, then every local city council would have to go to the drawing board, look at their existing policies, work with the development community, the landlord community, the tenant rights groups, regular Angelenos to think about how could we change the policy or should we change the policy. So no, if Costa-Hawkins is repealed tomorrow, it does not implement rent control across the board.
I wanted to turn to the developer voices here and Alan Greenlee. When we hear Trinidad talk about what he's hoping for with Proposition 10, there's also voices, very loud voices from the landlord community and from some development community folks talking about, what happens if landlords cannot charge market rate for their buildings. Does that mean that you dampen the development of new housing? Does that mean that people don't want to get into the business of building and maintaining housing if they're not able to make market rate on those units? Do you have a perspective on what occurs if Costa-Hawkins is repealed and local municipalities do institute rent control? Do you think it'll dampen development?
So I'm going to say that SCANF supports Proposition 10. So clearly we don't think that it's going to chill the market. I think we believe in democracy. One of the things I wanted to say at the outset was one of the great things that has happened over the last couple of years is the notion of affordability, particularly around homelessness, has struck the public consciousness in a way that's unprecedented. And this full room is an example of it. The fact that you guys are carrying it and talking about it, the media has done a really good job of pushing this public dialogue about what we're going to do about affordability. We believe that repealing Costa-Hawkins offers the opportunity for communities to have a robust conversation and debate about what are the needs for residents and what are the pressures or the outcomes that would happen on the market side about whether it would actually slow down development or not. So, we believe that the solution to our affordability crisis is a broad, long-term and concerted effort, and that includes a ton of different kinds of approaches. And that's why we believe that Proposition 10 should pass.
And Tony Salazar, do you have any take on, is it going to ultimately dampen development? Why get into the apartment business if you cannot charge market rate?
Yeah, and I agree with both Ben and Alan. I think I'll give you my perspective. I'm a developer. I've developed about 25,000 units. I manage about 33,000. And every night I was about 100,000 people that sleep in our developments. And they're people of different incomes. They're in New Orleans. I have a development that has homeless. 5% of the units are homeless. I have public housing, low-income tax credits, and market rate, all equally living in a 500-unit development. And I have all these kinds of mixes of incomes. So, I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, is can a development function? Can it be financed? Can it operate? Can it be acceptable to the community if there's a mix of incomes? In this country, we rip this country apart by incomes. And the real estate industry has done a lot of it. A lot of you live in buildings or neighborhoods or in subdivisions that the price of the homes are in a very narrow margins. And so people of similar incomes gravitate to it. And that's the way we are in our society in all over the place. So I'm okay with mixes of incomes, mixes of restrictions. I'm used to that. I know how to operate it. The private sector, the way it operates, the way it gets financing from Wall Street and investments and REITs and other kinds of things, will find it difficult to continue to invest and develop with some restrictions. But I've got to tell you that from a developer's perspective, I've never seen a developer go broke building and operating a mixed income development. I've never seen their property values decrease, nor have I seen property values around it decrease in any way. So I think there's just a lot of myth there, and I think it can operate and function just fine.
Trinidad Ruiz, we heard Tony talk about a mix of incomes. There are some folks talking about maybe adding means testing to rent control ordinances when municipalities look at passing them locally. What do you make of the idea of, say, putting an income threshold on capping rent increases? Any comments on that?
Well, I think it would be a good idea to begin to to cap rents. I think, in general, there needs to be a public sector, or rather a government overview of the entire rental market. I think it should be based on your income and not what the market says that you should be paying in rent. I mean, we did it in World War II. That's where HUD came from. You had the government marshaling all its resources to create housing for, hundreds and thousands of people, millions of people across the country. And I think we've lost sight of that. This land is a limited resource. It's not infinite. We don't have infinite space. So we need regulation. And the government needs to, I think there should be government oversight of this. In Vienna, 64% of the population lives in subsidized housing. And in this country, less than 1% does. And most of the folks there don't own homes. It's funny that, homeowners get tax breaks to own the home, but what do renters get? You're incentivized. All that money, where is it going? You can use that money to help bring down rents for regular tenants. It's communities throughout Los Angeles also aren't shouldering, all of these communities aren't shouldering the cost of construction as well. You have places like Echo Park, Boyle Heights, all that construction is happening there. Let's zone up places like Hancock Park. Let's zone up places like Bel Air. Let's build some affordable housing out there, but of course they won't want that. Maybe I don't know if that's something that the mayor is considering to do any changes like that in these communities. We should shoulder the burden. Like I said, land is a finite resource. It needs to be regulated.
I do just want to mention that we invited the California Apartment Association to attend, and I don't believe, it doesn't look like the California Apartment Association was able to make it. Of course, representing landlords in California who oppose Proposition 10, again, for reasons of wanting to charge market rate for their units and things like that. So we have to move along a little bit quickly here, but yeah.
Could I just interject real quickly on the Prop 10 question? I'm imagining that the Apartment Association would have said, yeah, it's going to chill the market. It's going to be bad for developers. I would just say that the legislation or the initiative that passed in November 2016, Measure JJJ, was met with the same opposition. And what we found is through the Transit-Oriented Communities Program in the first 9 months, we've had, as been mentioned, 5,000 apartments, 5,000 homes be put on the books, with 20% of those being for low-income folks. And but what we haven't had happen is there's been almost a 100% drop in zone change and general plan amendments, which is really a tool that developers would use to get value from the city without any exchange back, no contribution back other than just building a market rate unit. And so policy that those who oppose it consider to be market chilling, if you build it the right way, it works. So you can make money, you can build market rate housing, and you can do affordable. So you can do all of them.
And we're going to open up to audience questions in just one moment. I just have a final question to throw at the panel. Ben, you mentioned density earlier in the conversation, and there was a statewide bill that failed pretty quickly in committee earlier this year from State Senator Scott Wiener, specifically about building more dense housing, taller units near transit. And it got a huge amount of pushback from parts of LA, especially when it came to losing local control for state, legislators to come in and say LA has to build faster in certain areas. Is there any conversation about that bill coming back in some form, increasing the height, increasing the density near transit, the way that State Senator Scott Wiener was suggesting, and what would that mean for Los Angeles?
Yeah, it's a good question. It certainly sparked a lot of debate, right? Not just here in Los Angeles, but across the state. I think, the mayor is very appreciative of Senator Wiener putting forward a bold proposal, because we certainly need bold proposals to really change the game for housing. However, that proposal was particularly blunt tool, especially for a place like Los Angeles. I mean, you look at a place like South Los Angeles, and we have a lot of single-family neighborhoods that are really unique neighborhoods, and frankly, a lot of them are majority renter-owned developments or housing as well. So, kind of having Sacramento rezone all of South Los Angeles' renter single-family zoning is a little much. So I think we've looked at our local policy, the Transit-Oriented Communities Program that we've talked about twice or 3 times already. But I think looking at something like that is much more nuanced, that really it's kind of a tier-based structure, that kind of the incentives go up as you get closer to transit, or as your transit station is more higher quality transit station. Not every transit station is the same. Then the incentives get bigger, and it's more of an incentive-based structure that's really targeted towards commercial corridors and not necessarily those traditional single-family neighborhoods where a lot of renters live. So I think we'd be interested in looking at new legislation that would kind of take something like we're doing here across the state.
Yeah, Tony.
let me add just real quick. I followed Wiener's bills through Sacramento. I think he's on the right track regarding density. His politics was bad, and his politics and how he was interacting with cities and neighborhoods and trying to bring them along.
There wasn't a lot of local buy-in.
You were right with the term blunt. I mean, it was just this is what I want it to be. So I think it'll come back around, but it needs to be massaged and going through a lot of local politics, local groups, bring everybody along. But the thing is, we need density. Despite, people contradicted me here today, but we need density because we need units. We don't have, we look at our population versus the number of housing units we have versus the number of units we're producing. I'm talking about units at all income levels, from homelessness to affordable to people making minimum wage to middle income. We are short, and we don't like density in a lot of these neighborhoods. We need to increase the amounts of housing, the density of housing, and putting them next to transit corridors, transit stops. I mean, we need to start thinking about if we're going to add a few more million people. I can't remember what the number is, Ben. 3 more million people here in population. Where are we going to put them? Where do we house them? And certainly trading, people going into neighborhoods like at Westlake, MacArthur Park, and people coming in with higher incomes there to displace people. That's not a way to rebuild cities. We have to think about density, mixed income, and creating housing for people of all incomes. I think a city accommodates its people who contribute to its growth and prosperity, regardless of the job they do, regardless of the amount of money they make. That's what great cities do. And that's how we have to think about as we're going forward, everybody getting out of their bubble, working together to focus on helping build housing, but building the city at the same time. Remember, our city is prosperous. Our city is growing. Our city is great. Our city has a lot of jobs and a lot of income, a lot going on. But a booming city is not raising all boats. And that's the part that Trinidad's talking about, the homeless issues. They're all symptomatic of these issues. And we have to keep thinking forward down the road as to how we're going to solve this problem and rebuild the city at the same time.
And with that, I just want to open it up to audience questions. And I want to mention that we're going to have a whip around with all of our panelists at the end, because another question that came up again and again from audience members is, what can I individually do about homelessness and about affordability? So that'll be our closing last words with our panelists. But Tess Banco is in the audience, the director of the UCLA Family Wellness Center at the West LA VA. Hi, Tess.
Hi, thank you so much. And first of all, I want to say thank you to all the housing experts. So no matter what you agree that the situation is or how to best address it, I want to say thank you because personally, my family, when I was younger, we lived 6 in a car. So it's come a long way. For me, the key was education. But when you talk about raising all boats and building those coalitions, I'm wondering what the most tangible strategies for doing that is in your mind. So what are the best ways? I know there's a lot of NIMBYism, the CEQA challenges, those types of things getting thrown in the way, roadblocks. So what are some things that have really contributed to coalition building? Thank you.
I'd be interested to hear Trinidad talk about coalition buildings off the top.
Well, coalition, I mean, in terms of lifting all boats, that's a really complicated question because you're talking about, things like rent burden, income, housing. Los Angeles is diverse, is a diverse city, but I think I think housing, and in that sense, housing the way you lift all boats is by making sure that the rent burden of low-income families is not more than they can bear. That's what's happening. There are families at the Burlington building that are paying 50% of their income in rent. That means less food for them, that's less clothing, less expendable cash, and then the rent goes up and they're paying 70%. So again, I think housing has a lot to do with how we're living in Los Angeles. And now we have things like, you can get a second job driving for Uber, making ends meet that way. How many people do that just to pay the rent? So in terms of quality of life, in terms of housing, it's the central and focal point of this conversation. And again, it's not going to happen through market forces.
Yeah.
I'm going to start this off and then hand it off maybe to Alan, too, about coalition building, because we just were successful in passing the city's first affordable housing mandate, right, ever. It's called the Affordable Housing Linkage Fee. It's kind of, I look at it as sort of like an inclusionary zoning policy or inclusionary zoning light. It's a policy that says if you're a market rate developer and you're building multifamily housing, you have to include affordable housing on site, if not pay a fee that could potentially raise up to $100 million a year to capitalize affordable housing programs, preservation initiatives, home ownership programs, new construction, a variety of different things that are not federally funded so that we can be a lot more innovative in how we do this. But the city has tried to pass this particular initiative, I think, for 3 decades. A few different mayors have tried to pass it, and it failed multiple times. We initiated it back in December 2015 or something, and it took a very long time to pass through the legislative cycle. It took a lot of concerted studies to make sure we kind of get it right as a city policy, that we strike that right balance so we're not negatively impeding the development market, but we're kind of harnessing it the right way. But there's no way it could have ever passed if we didn't build a coalition with organizations like SCAMF, who really, I think, is the best partner to talk about the coalition building for that.
Alan Greenlee with SCAMF.
So all I can say is that, they couldn't pass it for 30 years, and then I started working on it, and it worked.
So the trick is Alan Greenlee.
That's exactly right. So we all know what the secret sauce is. No, I mean, it goes back to the democracy question. I was riding my bike to work about a year before we started on the linkage fee campaign. I was sitting at the light, and the guy pulled up next to me, and passenger window was down. And the guy in the passenger seat said, LA's the most unaffordable place to live in the country. And then the light turned green, and he drove off. And I was like, oh, my God. Like the man on the street knows
Literally
about my thing, right? And so there is no doubt that democracy works. The reason those things ended up on the ballot was because the citizens of this city, this county, and this state said, it's got to happen. And the elected officials said, okay. And so the primordial soup is there. It's the coalition building that is the lightning, right? That sort of turns, we get the fish with the lungs and all that. I'm not going to pursue that one anymore. But we came together with what was an unusual coalition for us. We got with some of our normal traditional partners, community-based organizations that were in the business of affordable housing development, with tenant organizing groups, with labor unions, with business sector and others, and faith. Thank you very much. The faith-based community was huge in this campaign, and then on other issues, we sort of align with different people. So the idea is that you sort of take who's amenable and who's result-oriented and wants to get to yes, and we sort of get that group together, and then we use the momentum that everybody in this room really creates.
Next question.
Is it on?
Way up in the lights. We can't quite see, but
I wanted to know what the general consensus might be with accessory dwelling units, whether the NGOs and the city sector or county sector thinks that's a worthwhile thing to really develop, and why the city doesn't provide more funding for that, since cost per unit is much lower than building new, whether it's the city that's helping with it or private entities that are now getting into doing accessory dwelling units.
And your first name, sir?
Stephen.
Stephen's question about accessory dwelling units, or granny flats is the way I like to say it. Ben Winter, do you want to tackle that?
Sure. It's a really great question. Thanks for asking it. The mayor supported state legislation that really removed a lot of barriers that homeowners face in developing accessory dwelling units, and that comes in, again, Baskin-Robbins, 31 flavors. There's a lot of ways you could do an accessory dwelling unit. You could build a new one in your backyard, or you could maybe convert your garage, an existing facility, into housing, or legalize an unpermitted backyard dwelling unit. So we've supported the state legislation to remove those barriers, and the city, we've got an innovation team supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies that's been working on how do we kind of educate homeowners on the process for doing that. We worked with UCLA, your colleagues over there, who produced kind of a really nice guidebook on how homeowners can do that, and we're trying to figure out, are there ways to finance that, to help homeowners finance it? It's kind of a new thing, so the private market is trying to figure it out. But really, I think what the name of that game was, maybe the government should kind of get out of the way a little bit, and the private market can kind of help innovate. We've seen in the last year twice as many applications for accessory dwelling units in the city than we've had in the last decade. So this certainly is not going to be a panacea. It's not going to solve our housing crisis and our housing shortage, but it will kind of help provide new housing opportunities in much higher opportunity neighborhoods even. So we'll finally have rental opportunities in higher income homeownership, single family neighborhoods that have good schools and safe streets that renters can finally enter. So we're definitely looking to find ways to encourage that in the city of Los Angeles in a way that makes sense and kind of maintains the neighborhood character.
Just one more question so that we can get to our whip around with our panelists. And your first name before you start the question?
Sure. My name's Brandy with the LA Aging Advocacy Coalition. Worked with Alan and Ben both on the linkage fee. And I'd like to say that, I get a lot of outside people looking in saying, why isn't anything being done, or why is everyone just out to make a profit? And the one thing I'll say is that as our coalition started digging into these solutions, it's important for people to realize that there's a lot of really good people working really hard to try and figure out these solutions. And that if you come to the table saying it's not going to work, then it's not going to work, right? And that we all have to be willing to expand our own views of what we want in order to find solutions that'll work for everyone. So I just want to preface that because I know there's a lot of bad rap about builders and developers and profits and capital and all of these different things. So just want to preface that. But I do want to kind of put you on the hot seat a little bit, Alan, because as I understand it, and I'm very happy to be working in coalition with you all, but as I understand it, it costs almost twice as much to build an affordable unit as it does a market rate unit. Why is that? Why is it the same lumber, the same everything can cost almost twice as much? And I'm not saying we shouldn't build it because we do need the solutions, but if we could lower that price, we could do so much more. Like, what's happening there?
Thanks, Brandy. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Brandy.
I'm glad she asked you.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll just challenge your whatever the. Thank you. Challenge the premise. So, first of all, we don't know what it costs to build a market rate unit because they don't have to tell us. The last time somebody tried to do that was about 5 years ago. I think the state did a really long, concerted research project to try to figure out what were the drivers of cost of affordable housing, and they actually couldn't get a representative sample of the data on the market rate side. But I don't want to dodge the question of cost. All the reasons that Tony talked about. So land is expensive. If we can get a situation where we can get donated land, that helps us out a ton. Building materials are expensive. I'm going to just do a real quick thing. So my guys build a building and it costs 10. A market rate guy builds the same building and it costs 10. The market rate guy charges then rents that bring him in 13. If we covenant, if we say that we're going to keep these units affordable to low-income people, we can only realize income of about somewhere between 3 and 7. And so the difference is made up by public sector money. It's money that you guys voted for on HHH. It's money that you guys voted for, that your representatives voted for on things like the linkage fee. So the lifeblood is that public subsidy dollar that fills the gap. So all the traditional hard costs are there, just like they are in the market rate sector. And then on the public side, when we get the public money, there are obligations that we sort of bring with that also. So we pay prevailing wage. We actually believe that we should have to pay the people that build our buildings a rate that allows them to afford to live here. And that doesn't happen in the private sector necessarily. We do a lot of things like do sustainability activities. We've got bamboo floors, and we've got hot water solar panels, and we're generating electricity, and we're charging cars. We have parking requirements, so we're putting in parking spaces, and in some cases in supportive housing, we're putting in parking spaces that are for people who don't necessarily have cars. So there are things that drive cost. We have to do those things.
All right, we do have to wrap, but sure, Tony.
Just a quick
briefly.
A quick fine point. Just to give you an example of, I develop all over this country, and take the same unit in Texas, I can build it for $199,000. Here in Los Angeles, I could build it for maybe $410,000. In San Francisco, it's about $895,000. Same unit, same materials, but there's issues in every state, every city that are different. And there's a lot of mandates that are different in every city. So the cost is layered on for a whole lot of different reasons, and Alan gave you a bunch of them, but they affect me. And as he was eloquently saying, say it a different way, when you house the lowest income people, the amount of rent that you can derive or charge them, that they can literally be able to pay 30% of their income, isn't enough to cover the cost of land, construction, operations, and that kind of thing. So I have to go to Ben and say, Ben, I'm going to build this unit. People can only pay X. I need Y from the federal government. Trinidad is right. The private sector doesn't do this. It does it in partnership with them. I was hoping you were speaking about me when you say there's some nice people out there. Because I've been developing affordable housing for 39 years. And this has been my life mission. And so I know how these things happen.
And I have to be the bad guy because I just have to cut you off, Tony. Sorry. I'm not the nice guy out there. And I just want to really quickly thank all my panelists today. We're going to launch into this whip around, which is answering the question that many, many listeners had, which is, as an individual Angelino, what can I do about homelessness? What can I do about affordability? So Ben Winter with Mayor Garcetti's office is going to be our first guinea pig on this. We're going to go really briefly whipping around to all of our panelists, including our first run about the homelessness. So Ben Winter, in about 15, 20 seconds. Absolutely. I certainly want to give everybody a chance to talk, and I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance to ask a question. Did you have a question that you just wanted to throw at our panel briefly? We can get you a microphone. Okay. Thanks so much. And in your first name, and let's get your question, please.
Hi, my name is Mary. I'm not typical homeless because I am highly educated. I'm an educator. I don't do drugs or alcohol. I have a chronic illness that's trying to kill me. So I would say, first of all, if I could just, and I'll make it a question, this is the elephant in the room that no politicians are talking about. I believe it's a national issue. I traveled up to Seattle recently, and on the train back, a man got on from San Jose Mercury News. Housing prices have doubled in 6 years. The median price of a home there is $920,000.
And Mary, we've been talking about affordability. So what's the question about affordability? Sorry to
I believe it's going to take a whole lot of money. Prop HHH and H are great, but like LA Times reporter talked with me about, is 10,000 units in 10 years. There's more than 60,000 homeless right now. The problem is only going to get worse. One thing you can do to help homeless, I would tell you, the reason there are homeless that need housing is because people that know somebody that's out on the street, or their brother or sister or their former coworker, are reluctant to allow people to sleep in their house or to assist them. There would be no need for homeless services if people actually cared for the people that they know.
Yeah.
Second of all, how
And
you
I
can
just
help
have to ask
homeless
this to be
is,
the close,
in
Mary.
my case,
Thank you.
I've got disability, but I only get $910 a month. I need somebody that's willing to rent to me at a lower price, like $400 a month. But the problem is, like with the landlords, like Barnes & Noble, bookstores closing, all the landlords want to make money. They want to make a profit. They all want to recoup
I
what they
absolutely
lost.
hear you, Mary. Thank you
And
so much for coming.
It's going to take
And if
a
we can take it
nationwide
on a
effort, because it's
sideboard
not
after that
just in LA.
we're done.
It's not even just in California.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your voice. Thank you. And I just really want to quickly turn back to our whip around. We were talking about individual Angelenos and what individuals can do. And Mary was mentioning a social safety net and people finding affordable rents. And I think that that's something a lot of our panelists had addressed earlier. And I turn the question to Ben Winter. What can individual Angelenos do, just about 15 seconds, to improve affordability and homelessness?
So, Mary, I agree with you, and I also agree with Elise from your previous panel that you need to speak up, but not just in your local community. But I think as we approach the new national elections in 2018, 2020, it's really important that we all, as citizens of this country, continue to talk about housing affordability and homelessness is not an LA problem. It's not a West Coast problem. It is a national problem. And it's a product of something that is not working in our society and our country, and we need the federal government to really step up. Right now, our housing safety net is a lottery. 1 in 4 people who need it get it, and it's basically based off of a lottery system. So we need to advocate at all levels of government, especially at the federal government. So I think that's very poignant, and thank you, Mary, for bringing it up.
Alan Greenlee with SCAMF.
Folks should go to the ballot on November 6th. They should vote yes on 1 and 2, propositions 1 and 2, because those will bring state resources to bear on the question of affordable housing development. They need to vote no on Proposition 5, which is basically a loss of $100 million a year that pays for services and housing and education, things like that. And then they need to vote for Proposition 10.
Tony Salazar.
Yes. My company, McCormick Barron Salazar, has 1,100 employees that are built to produce housing, but we don't know how to do housing for the homeless. So we partnered with LA Family Housing, the best organization in Southern California that knows about wraparound services, coordinated entry systems, and those kinds of things. It's good. It's a dynamic partnership, and I say that because this is to all the private developers out there, not to be afraid to come in and help meet this challenge of building more units for the homeless. And there's good organizations to partner with.
Individuals, what can they do to help affordability and homelessness? Trinidad Ruiz.
Well, on a national level, you see that the price of a unit and the price of a building costs differently. But there are rent strikes all around this country. People are being displaced. and you're reading it in papers like the New York Times, The Nation, etc. On a local level, definitely the ballot box. Vote yes on Prop 10. If you rent, you should organize, because then after that, we're going to have to put pressure on our city council members and local government to pass and expand rent control. It's really at this point, it's the only way. And then repeal laws like the Ellis Act, pass more inclusionary zoning laws. So it requires your presence. This is your government. You pay for it. You're paying taxes. Get involved. Get organized.
Elise Buick, United Way.
So go to everyoneinla.org, sign up, follow us on Twitter. Our great organizers are here. Get connected to them, have your voice heard, and be part of saying yes to housing in your neighborhood.
Peter Lynn with LASA.
All of those things. Go to your neighborhood council meetings and say yes. Participate directly in neighborhood stuff. Participate in city council hearings. Go and talk to people and let them know that you support all the assistance that we can do, whether it's interim housing, permanent supportive housing. All those things are really important. The other thing, just to acknowledge what Mary was talking about, you need to acknowledge the people who are experiencing homelessness in our communities. One of the most pernicious things that we do is ignore people who are around us who are experiencing homelessness. And our reality is socially constructed. When we negate the humanity of the people around us, it is really pernicious and has a devastating effect on folks. So you need to, participate in the community of people who are here, and many of them are unhoused. Acknowledge them as you pass them.
Felicia Adams Callum with St. Joseph Center.
I'd like to encourage people to get hands-on in this process, get to know people who are hurting. Join us. There's ways to serve every day. We need landlords to get hands-on in the solution. We're so grateful to the landlords that are housing our people, and we need to hire people who were previously homeless and hurting and traumatized because they have hearts that we need to have added to this work.
And Rudy Salinas with the Center at Blessed Sacrament.
I'm going to do a plug. Go to theaters in October to see a movie called The Advocates through the sponsorship of United Way, which tells the story of the workers that wake up every morning at the crack of dawn to go out to engage populations that we normally ignore. I know it'll be released in October. It's at the LA Film Festival. It's called The Advocates. I strongly encourage you to go see it because it's a unique way of looking at this issue.
All right, we're over time, and thanks so much for everybody who stuck around. Thanks to all of our panelists. And a big special thank you for the Japanese American National Museum for hosting us and KPCC's in-person team. Thanks, everybody.